So I think you can make an argument that Brazil has the most advanced crypto capital market structure than perhaps any other country in the world right now. Not necessarily in terms of the volumes. The volumes are not there when you compare with a US or a Western European country or Asian country. If we can't get crypto to work in Latin America, then what are we even doing as an industry? Because it's just such an obvious natural fit. And it's been just kind of shocking to me to see how, when you talk to just regular people in the industry, they kind of get it, but they're well, it's just not really a priority for us at the moment.
Hello and welcome to Brazil is Not for Beginners. Today, my guest is Aaron Stanley, founder of Brazil Crypto Report. We're going to talk about the crypto market in Brazil. So Aaron, thanks so much for joining me.
Thanks for having me, Isaac.
Yeah, really great. I know that you usually are on this side of the podcast, so excited to see how you do on the other side.
Yeah, absolutely. It's a nice change of pace. But yeah, it's almost more pressure and less pressure in different ways, but we'll see how I do here.
Disorient you a little bit, keep you on your toes. That's the idea. Again, great to have you on. Really appreciate it. For those who are listening who aren't familiar with you, can you just introduce yourself a little bit?
Yeah, absolutely. So, yeah, my name's Aaron, and I've been in Brazil for a couple of years now through a kind of a convergence of Brazilian family. My wife's Brazilian. I've always just been interested in Brazilian kind of culture and enjoyed coming here over the years, even back when we lived in the US, where I've been working as a journalist and also in crypto for most of my career. And I guess the convergence of those two areas meant that I could finally work remotely. And we decided basically during the pandemic in 21, hey, we're living in Minnesota where it's freezing and schools are all closed and everything. Maybe we should experiment with spending a season in Brazil for a little bit. So we came down here during the pandemic and enrolled my son in just the local school here. And I was wow, this is actually a pretty cool experience. Then we went back to Minnesota for a bit. And then we decided to come back for Christmas in 22 and stay for a month. And then that month turned into going on 25 months now.
Yeah, it's nice to not have to dig your car out of the snow, right?
Yeah, definitely. I miss, I grew up in northern Minnesota with winters 5 months a year, and I do appreciate some components of that lifestyle.
I'm from upstate New York, so I get it.
Preaching to the choir here, but there are definitely some perks to living in a tropical country. We'll put it that way. And then just career wise, I started really getting into crypto and Bitcoin in 2015, 2016. I mean, funny enough, I used to work for the Financial Times in Washington as a reporter there. And my editor just had pinged me one day saying hey, can you do a story about the Winklevoss twins Bitcoin ETF? They were the early pioneers of trying to get a Bitcoin ETF over the finish line.
Gemini, right?
I think Gemini still existed. It was just emerging at this point, but their first play was really trying to get a Bitcoin ETF over the finish line. This was 2013, 2014. The Winklevoss twins had this very kind of, mixed reputation, right? I'd seen the Social Network movie and
Yeah, I was going to mention.
And they had this kind of reputation as a meathead, Harvard bro guys, old money, sort of New England type boarding school frat bro type dudes, right? Where it's all right, they seem pretty impressive, but okay, are these types of guys I really want to be taking advice from? I'm not really sure, right? It's like taking, dating advice from Tom Cruise or something. It's what's that going to do for you?
Yeah.
So they were very generous, actually, interviewing the Winklevoss twins in 2016, just asking them about this. They kind of red pilled me on Bitcoin. They had this whole kind of 9-point thesis mapped out for why they think Bitcoin's a better version of gold and just kind of their whole vision for it. I was wow, that's actually pretty interesting. What thendese guys are saying. Ended up writing an article that got published, in the FT. As a journalist, you're kind of used to getting kind of hate mail and various criticisms for things that you say or you write. But I've never in my life received so much feedback on one particular article, both positive and negative. It's death threats and people are Winklevoss twins are heretics. Why'd you talk to them? And all this kind of stuff. Wow, people in this community are really passionate. So I was maybe I should be looking into this area more, right? Because there's something going on here that people are really excited about in various levels of extremity, I guess. And then really from there, I was kind of trying to transition out of journalism, actually. Ended up kind of needing work. So I was doing some freelance stuff on the side, ended up getting hooked up with a publication called CoinDesk, which was kind of the premier crypto trade publication. So I spent some time working there as a reporter and editor. And that was during the 2017 kind of season when Bitcoin went from being nobody had ever heard of it to by the end of 2017, it was
Taxi driver started telling you about it.
Yeah, you have taxi drivers telling you, with their price apps open and their trading apps and all that kind of stuff. So I was okay, I think maybe I kind of won the lottery on picking a good industry to be a part of here because there's a lot of stuff going on. Anyway, so I spent a couple of years working there and I ended up starting this Brazil project just sort of as a result of kind of a skill stacking idea, right? I've been reading all these kind of professional development books and all these gurus saying you got to find your skill stack, right? Take the things you're good at and then figure out how to stack them and to give yourself kind of a unique advantage advantage. So it's like, what am I good at? It's like, I know about crypto, I have some media kind of journalism competencies, and I know a lot about Brazil. And I was spending some time here during 2021 during the pandemic, which was also a crazy crypto bull market.
Yes, it was.
Bitcoin went up to like, mid 60s. That was also another moment where like Brazilian taxi drivers are like asking me about Dogecoin and all this kind of stuff. So it's like, for a market of 200 million people, pretty big market. When I was working at CoinDesk, I was like, there's really like no English language coverage at all of like anything that's going on in this market, even though it's enormous. Right. So I was like, maybe there's an opportunity here to do like an independent media, just sort of newsletter or platform, just trying to create some content about what's happening here. And let's just kind of see how it goes. And 3 years later, I'm still here doing this,
Yes.
kind of grinding it out, but it's been pretty rewarding. And, I'd love to kind of talk more about some of that experience, but that's sort of like the short and sweet of how I got here and who I am.
Awesome. That's really cool. A lot of journalists here in Brazil, expats or people with journalism experience, I think it's that idea of curiosity and learning about other cultures that pervades. And a couple of the things that you mentioned really resonate with me. So, starting this podcast on my end also was just noticing that there was a lack of content in English about Brazil. Me just realizing that all the content I'm reading is in Portuguese and getting asked by investors or whatever, hey, can you tell me about this or can you tell me about that? Me pointing them to an article and them being like, I can't read that. So that's not very helpful for me. And so creating something in this, you said you started the newsletter, I guess 2022. Is that right?
Yeah, I think it was like late 21 when I started. And then I started doing the podcast. So it's a newsletter plus a podcast and kind of the other YouTube multimedia elements. So I started the newsletter in like late 21 and I started rolling out the podcast in 22. Yeah, 21, 22-ish was when we started.
Okay, very cool. And so you talked a little bit about kind of your exposure to crypto through this article on the Winklevoss twins, your exposure to Brazil through your family, kind of how you ended up down here. And I want to talk a lot about what your experience has been like living in Brazil as a gringo. I don't know how good your Portuguese is and how you've picked it up. You don't live in Sao Paulo. So I want to talk a little bit about some of these other places outside of kind of the big centers as well. But I do want to start talking about the crypto scene here. And you mentioned that you were starting to get talked to by some of these folks, taxi drivers, more middle class people. The crypto bubble hit Brazil as well. And so, can you talk a little bit about the crypto scene in Brazil and how it's different from other markets? So, I was also exposed to crypto about the same time you were, like 2014. I was introduced to the guys at Zappo in Argentina, and that made more sense to me because the Argentine peso is so volatile. But in Brazil, not a super confident currency, but also not nearly as volatile as some of the other ones. So, what is the Brazilian crypto scene like, and what's been some of the drivers behind it?
Yeah, it's a great question. It's interesting because all across Latin America, you have almost all these interesting prototype markets for different use cases of crypto, right? Where Argentina is kind of like an edge case where you
Yep.
have this, just perpetual currency crisis. And then markets, like Venezuela, for example, where you have kind of this authoritarian regime and people have to use crypto peer to peer as a way to transact, kind of another sort of novel like edge case that's been proving out to be valuable. Markets like Mexico or Colombia that are very heavily reliant on like remittances from the US. It's kind of like the unsung use case of crypto. It's not really a sexy one, but I think something like 10% of the remittance corridor of US to Mexico runs on like crypto rails. Doesn't necessarily mean that people in Mexico are receiving crypto, but just that those payments are being transferred kind of on the back end through various crypto rails, whether it be XRP ledger or different types of blockchains. Like companies like Bitso are pretty heavily involved in that. And Brazil's a bit interesting in that there's not this existential currency crisis always right around the corner, but you don't have very deep capital markets. There's not a lot of investment opportunities for like average people. You do have, we'll call it a culture of speculation, to put it diplomatically, where we've seen this play out with a lot of this Chigrinho stuff and these betting sites that just really proliferated over the last year or two. So there is this hunger to, a lot of Brazilians, like they live day to day, hand to mouth, right? So there is this desire to like, okay, is this a way that I can get rich quick? Or is this a way I can improve my financial situation? Like what I'd say about Brazil is like you have a lot of like adoption and a lot of usage. You don't necessarily have a lot of crypto industry. And maybe I'll use Argentina as an analogy where like Argentina, you have a lot of the players who are like very core to the development of Bitcoin and crypto as an industry came from Argentina. And even if you look at various crypto projects right now around the world, like pretty much any crypto project is going to have some Argentine guy like on the team, right? Like a developer or somebody. And even going back to, guys like Sergio Damon Lerner who are involved in like building out, the Bitcoin blockchain in like 2011 and all this kind of stuff. Like people that were like really core. And even like with Lazapo, to your point, like Wences Casares, he's basically the guy that convinced Silicon Valley that Bitcoin was a real thing that they should pay attention to,
Yeah.
right? Which is pretty significant. Whereas in Brazil, you just don't really have that level of engagement, but you do have a lot of people like using crypto. So there's actually like more people who have accounts on like Mercado Bitcoin, for example, which is one of the larger kind of domestic exchanges, than you have that have like investments in the stock market here. And according to various reports of global adoption of crypto, thinking specifically about a report by Chainalysis, which is kind of the leading like analytics company where they have the best information out there as far as who's using crypto for what and where. And they do this big report every year that highlights what are the top countries that are using crypto. And Brazil is always in the top 10 globally, up there with like Philippines, US, China. Argentina is usually pretty high as well for reasons we discussed. But Brazil is always among the top 10. And it's much more of an investment use case than it is like a payments use case or like kind of a peer-to-peer or remittance type of use case. It's much more of an investment that is prominent here. And the other interesting thing that I would say is that if you talk to the folks at MetaMask wallet, so MetaMask is like a standard piece of infrastructure in crypto. Like if you're going to interact with any kind of on-chain protocols or anything, you're usually going to access that via like a MetaMask or another type of wallet. Brazil has been one of the largest markets for MetaMask downloads. Last I heard, it was actually the second largest market for MetaMask downloads globally, which signifies that the people that download MetaMask and use MetaMask tend to be more advanced users than people who are just opening a Coinbase account and buying some Bitcoin or something, right?
Yeah, there's more steps to the interaction, right?
Yeah, it requires a lot more skill and a lot more knowledge, right? So that signifies that there's a lot of very advanced traders in this market if they're going to be using that type of product. When I say like you have a lot of usage, but maybe not necessarily a lot of industry, but it's not what you'd expect for a market of 200 million people and, whatever the GDP of Brazil is nowadays, like 2 trillion or something. I'm not sure what exactly it is, but pretty big. You would expect a larger kind of industry being developed in this country just based on that statistic alone than what you have. And I think a lot of the developments industry here has perhaps been hampered by some of the factors that hamper just any other type of tech or startup development where it's, accessing capital isn't always easy. Like there's a lot of bureaucracy. You have a brain drain problem where a lot of the people that are just really talented, they just leave because it's easier to launch your thing in the US or wherever, right? Some of these problems are like not unique to crypto, right? This is just a kind of a general business climate issue that has also kind of hampered the growth and development of this industry. Not to say things aren't growing and developing, but things could be a little bit further along had there not been some of these impediments.
That all makes sense. One thing you said that I found really interesting was that more Brazilians hold crypto than are probably invested in the local stock market. And I'm curious what you attribute that to, because there's dueling factors that might be there. And so one is I actually had somebody from B3, the stock exchange, on last year to talk about that. And they're growing, but it's still a low base and excited about the growth, but still, 5 million people or something like that have an account with them. And so on the one end, it's a lack of access to the stock exchange. On the other end, one of the other thing that always comes up here is how interested Brazilians are in technology and how interested they are in social media and how that drives Brazilians' engagement with technology and with new technology specifically. And so I'm just wondering if you could talk a little bit about where do you think some of this interest is coming from? You mentioned maybe it is a source of wealth creation, maybe it is a way to get rich quick, right? Or whatever it might be. But what are some of the underlying factors there that you think that are driving this interest in crypto usage in the market? And then I want to come back to the crypto industry because I think that's also a really interesting area to talk about.
Yeah, it's a great question. And it's hard to like really give like a precise answer. On the one hand, Brazilians are just early adopters of every kind of technology out there, right? The first time I came to Brazil, I think in 2009 or 10 or something, I just started dating my wife. I didn't even have a smartphone yet, but like the guy that was driving us around had like two smartphones open. One, he's got like a police like radar detector type thing on one. It was like, dang, this guy's pretty impressive. And Brazilians have, over the years, just any new trend, like they are the first adopters, right? They're kind of like the beta market for the world in that sense. So in one sense, crypto is just something that's like, oh, this is new, this is interesting. A lot of how Brazilians like learn about things or make decisions is a lot of this is kind of based on like familial networks where it's like, I have a lot of people from like my wife's family who are coming like, oh, Aaron's like this Bitcoin guy. Like I should go ask him about Bitcoin, right? And I'm like, well, like don't buy Bitcoin just because like I told you to buy it, but I'm happy to like try to like at least point you in the right direction. So I think a lot of this stuff kind of spreads organically just through like, WhatsApp groups or just family groups or whatever. But I think it is just kind of like this new shiny thing, right? So people are like, oh, this is interesting. And if you look at the B3 and like, the IB investment, there's just not a lot of stuff in there that's really interesting to like invest in.
Right. Where's the cool new tech company?
Yeah, I have to like really be a true believer to like sell some of my Bitcoin and buy shares of Volley or something. I just think like a lot of the options in capital markets today, as far as investment opportunities, just aren't really that attractive to people. And a lot of people gravitate toward things that are a bit more concrete, like real estate. A lot of people I talk to, like their retirement plan is basically, hey, I'm just going to try to buy up 2 or 3 different apartments, condominiums, and just kind of rent these things out for cash flow. And then if I need to sell one when I'm older to like pay bills, I can do that. And that seems to work generally pretty well. If
Yeah.
you live in one of these bigger cities, there's definitely like no shortage of demand for reasonable quality places to live. And also, there's just a lot of like these fixed income products that where you can get 15% return
Yeah.
for doing nothing. But if you're somebody who's trying to kind of bootstrap yourself, right? Like cryptos, there's really not a whole lot of other options aside from, we don't have to get into like the sports betting stuff
No,
because
we
that's a
don't
whole
need to get
nother
into that one. Yeah.
conversation I have a lot of opinions on. But
Understood. I think that all makes sense. And there is an element of people looking for engagement through their investing as well, which, like you said, is not coming through the stock exchange as much as people would like. Do you see the growth of some of these dollar investment platforms impacting the growth of crypto here? So you mentioned the lack of options, but you're starting to see companies like Nomad or Avenues or some of these other guys pop up that allow you to do a little bit more. Is that impacting at all how people think about crypto and how the market's evolving, or not really?
I'm not super familiar with these particular platforms. Like I know they exist and know
Yeah.
generally what they do, but they haven't really been players in crypto, I guess, up until this point. I would say that probably like Nubank has definitely been a catalyst. Like they've
Yeah.
had a crypto brokerage product available for 2+ years now. They onboarded like 3 million users to that within like the first month or two. It was insane. They actually broke. I mean, I've heard this secondhand, so I can't 100% confirm this, but like I've heard from multiple people that when Nubank launched their crypto product, these crypto brokerages, they have to report their customer transaction activity to the Receita Federal on like an ongoing basis. So like when Nubank launched this platform, like they actually broke the Receita Federal system because they were like sending in so much information that it actually like took down the system.
Oh, wow.
Just as a little anecdote of how much of a demand driver Nubank was, right? And if you have a Nubank account, you can go buy crypto directly in the app. Like you can buy Bitcoin, you can buy Ethereum, you can buy USDC stable coins. These stable coins now, I don't know if it's now or at least at some point in the future, like you can actually earn yield on holding these dollar denominated stable coins. They just announced a partnership about that a couple months ago. I don't know if it's live yet or not. And then you can actually transfer the coins from your Nubank account to like your own personal wallet also. So it's not just one of these things where it's all just kind of a mirage and it's all just on paper. Like you can actually self custody these assets yourself. So that's been a big driver. And there's a lot of other of these platforms as well, like things like PicPay. They had a crypto platform for a while. I mean, that's obviously a big product here. They actually shut theirs down. They closed down their crypto business, but maybe a year ago, year and a half ago. And there's various reasons for like why they did that. They had a lot of users, but I've heard from various people that the average ticket size for an order was like 10 reais or something, which you're not really going to make any money on that. You know what I mean? But then also they were trying to supposedly go public in the US, and the US at that time was obviously not like very favorable toward crypto, and dealing with US financial regulators there while offering crypto could have been messy. So they shut down that product. But there's still other platforms like Mercado Pago. You can buy crypto through these platforms. Even like the big banks, BTG Pactual has its own crypto brokerage app called MINT. Itaú has its own brokerage app that's been up for about a year now, a little over a year. Some of these other kind of smaller digital banks like Banco Inter and some of these guys also have like crypto brokerage within the app directly. I mean, that's like a huge distinguishing point. I think that's just not something you see in other markets. That's not something you see in the US. Like I can't go to JP Morgan as just a retail guy.
Yeah, it seems much more mainstream.
I mean, if I'm like some, high net worth guy and I'm like, go to JP Morgan, hey, I want to buy some Bitcoin, they might be like, sure, well, I'm sure they offer that service. But if I'm just some random Zanding gang or whatever, like they're gonna be like, no, like you're crazy, get out of here. Here in Brazil, like a lot of these banks either have this product already launched or they are basically ready to be launched once there's some more regulations that come into play, which will be coming out in the coming months. And we can talk about that if you want. But I think a lot of players are just kind of waiting for the central bank. Once they come out with like kind of the official regulations, then we'll be comfortable launching this. But from what I understand, it's clicking a button on their end to basically go live, right?
Very cool. I want to get into that, but I really like what you've been mentioning just prior to that and going a little bit deeper. And I've talked about this before, and I think you and I have talked about it as well. Is Brazil is known as like a fintech innovator, right? So you mentioned Nubank and Inter and some of these PicPay, these digital banking platforms. And Brazil is really known as like a market leader in the world in terms of fintech innovation. And, at the beginning of the conversation, you were saying that Brazil is not really known for its crypto infrastructure, but it does sound like maybe the innovation is actually coming from the big guys and that it is maybe more mainstream accepted to do crypto. So what I'm curious about is kind of Brazil is known as this fintech innovator, and where is the innovation happening around crypto? Or is it happening around crypto? And what it seems like you're saying here is maybe they're not building out the infrastructure, which I'm curious about because electricity is actually pretty cheap in Brazil because of the big dam. Although I think a lot of that ends up in Paraguay, the kind of the mining operations. But where is innovation happening? Because it sounds like maybe it's actually the big guys that are doing the quote unquote innovation. And maybe it's not so much minting new coins or doing some of that. It's actually just taking crypto, making it more mainstream as an investment opportunity to the populace at large.
Yeah, I think that's accurate. Perhaps crypto purists would lament that fact. Crypto's supposed to be, at least the roots of crypto are supposed to be this.
Democratization. Yeah.
It's like we're here to like fight the banks and take down the banks, not to be hoovered up by them, right? But yeah, I think you're 100% right. I think the innovation here really has come in fintechs. In crypto, you call them the TradFi, like traditional finance, TradFi, otherwise known as just finance, right? Like,
Yep.
but the banks and the fintechs and these guys have really been early adopters with offering these products to their customers, with embracing some of these things. Brazil was really the first major market to approve crypto ETFs. So I think the first Bitcoin ETF, I think it was like Bermuda or Canada or one of these countries, beat Brazil to launching a Bitcoin ETF by a week or two in April 2021. But Brazil now has something, I mean, I can't even count it. It's got to be almost like 20 different crypto ETFs that are now trading on the B3 exchange. And going back to the B3 question that you had earlier, if you look at the most purchased ETFs on the B3 are all crypto. 6 of the top 10 are all crypto ETFs.
Interesting.
So you have a bunch of different Bitcoin ETFs. You have a lot of like single asset ETFs, like Ethereum ETFs. You have Bitcoin ETFs. You have a lot of these kind of basket where it's like a basket of currencies, a basket of different cryptos that like Hashdex has. And I think QR Capital and maybe somebody else has like a basket type of ETF as well. So it's like there's 7 different cryptos in this basket, like Bitcoin, Ethereum, Litecoin, whatever. And these are pretty exotic products, right? So in the US, like you don't have this type of stuff. Like you have a Bitcoin ETF and you have an Ethereum ETF and you have a Bitcoin futures ETF or multiple of each of those segments. But just recently Hashdex was able to get approved like a crypto index ETF that's just Bitcoin and ETH. So it's like a 70% Bitcoin, 30% ETH or whatever. But here in Brazil, like we've got all that stuff and we've had that for a while. The volumes aren't enormous. They aren't enough to really move any markets in any significant way. But the CVM here, which is the Brazilian securities regulator, SEC, if you will, they've been pretty forward thinking in terms of approving these things, right? So just last year, there was a couple Solana ETFs that launched. So Solana is probably most famously now the chain on which this Javier Milei meme coin thing was launched on, which has caused a whole commotion, I guess. But this has been one of the hottest chains of the last couple of years. It's really where a lot of the activity is right now. And Brazil is the first country where a Solana ETF was launched. And even just earlier this week, an XRP, like a Ripple XRP ETF was launched here. So that's the world's first, as far as I know.
Okay. So there is some innovation here.
Yeah, it's definitely more on the capital markets front. So I think you can make an argument that really Brazil has the most advanced kind of crypto capital market structure than perhaps any other country in the world right now.
Interesting.
In terms of the overall kind of plumbing and the types of products available, not necessarily in terms of the volumes. The volumes are not there when you compare with a US or a Western European country or Asian country.
Yeah.
But just the fact that these things are in existence and they're being used and people are buying them, and it's been going on for quite some time. Where in the US, the crypto industry had to just fight like tooth and nail just to get a Bitcoin ETF approved, right? Like, hundreds of millions of dollars and like legal fees and all this stuff, lawsuits and just all sorts of trench warfare just to get a Bitcoin ETF approved, right? In Brazil, we've already had that for like 3 years and seems to be working fine. So anyway, I'd say to answer your question, that's where a lot of the innovation has come. You do see some interesting projects on the tokenization front. We call it like the real world asset, quote unquote,
Yep.
tokenization.
With alternative investment opportunities, things like that. Yeah.
So things like crowdfunding, there's been some companies that have been pushing the line on some of these things and they've got like reined back in by the CVM. But pretty interesting concepts where, for example, you know how they have this FIFA solidarity mechanism, which granted I didn't understand anything about until I started paying more attention to football in Brazil here. But basically, like, okay, if I'm Santos Football Club and I train up and develop Neymar, and then he gets sold to another team, Santos gets a cut of that sale every time he gets sold to another team.
Yep.
So there's actually some interesting projects of creating tokens representing like those proceeds, basically. So if
Okay.
you're like a Santos fan, you own this Santos token. Every time a player that developed by Santos gets sold to another team, you get a little dividend of that, basically, which is pretty cool.
Gotcha. Yeah.
So stuff like that, I haven't really seen that type of stuff being done anywhere else. I'm not sure how scalable this type of stuff is right now in terms of mass adoption kind of thing. Or obviously, if there's dividends being paid out, there's going to be like a securities law kind of framework that has to be really well codified and whatnot.
for sure.
But there's been some interesting experiments on that front. And I think you had mentioned something about the electricity does tend to be quite cheap here. The issue with mining here, unfortunately, is the import taxes of it importing in the hardware that you would need to mine in Brazil. It's basically like 100% import tax to ship in these ASIC miner devices, the hardware. I mean, I've been talking to a few people that have claimed to have found loopholes by which they can, through some creative accounting, minimize the burden of these taxes. I'm cheering them on, I guess. If they can figure out a way to do it, great. I haven't quite seen it yet, but
Yeah.
there's also some other folks that have tried just importing the parts of the ASIC and trying to manufacture it here locally or trying to assemble the parts here locally. But that's a whole additional operational sort of structure you need in place. Unfortunately, like, mining hasn't really caught on as like a major industry here in the way that you've seen in Paraguay and some other places in the region and around the world.
That all makes sense. One of the other areas I wanted to ask you about that's a little bit more mainstream. So, in all transparency, and we've talked about this more in traditional finance and come from that background and work in fintech, but related more to traditional finance stuff. So, Drex, the central bank digital currency, can you explain what that is and some of the innovations that are happening there? You also talked a little bit about some of the regulation around crypto. And so, how do those two things come together where you have the central bank working on this currency, but at the same time looking at how to permit this environment where there's other cryptocurrencies happening?
So Drex is interesting because I mean the way I describe it to people is like it's kind of like a Rorschach test in the sense where if you have five different people look at it, you get five different answers for what it is.
Yeah.
But basically at its core, what the central bank is trying to do is to create essentially a wholesale central bank digital currency CBDC framework in a tokenization environment that's all built on blockchain. And the idea, the vision, which comes from the former central bank governor, Roberto Campos Neto, is basically like moving Brazil's entire financial system essentially like on chain, right? Or tokenizing the financial system essentially. And they're not necessarily going to be building on like an open permissionless chain like a Solana or something. The validators and nodes in the network are all going to be permission regulated entities regulated by the central bank. Right now, they're running this pilot program. We're in phase two of the pilot, actually. And they've got, I think it's something like 16 different consortia that are operating in this pilot. And you have pretty much all the major banks in the country are represented in these consortia.
Okay.
There are a few different kind of crypto native companies that are also leading some consortia like Mercado Bitcoin. So phase one of the project was really just getting people like plugged into the network and getting nodes up and running and some basic things like sending this Drex currency back and forth between these various wallets. And then also the first project was tokenizing like a public bond, right? So the spinal cord of the economy, basically, which is the bond market. So they're looking at ways like how can we tokenize public debt and kind of make some of these instruments more accessible to people to purchase, et cetera, et cetera. And keeping in mind that Brazilian public government debt pays pretty high interest rates, right, compared to other regions around the world. So there's a way you can kind of make this more accessible to local investors as well as international investors. Like that could help just free up new capital inflows into that segment. So the whole idea is really just moving the financial system essentially like on chain in this regard, right? What that exactly looks like in practice, it's one of these things that I haven't really heard a really clear vision of what this is going to look like, to be honest. There's some various use cases of things of like delivery versus payment type of use cases where if I'm transacting a car or something and you know, we could structure the transaction so that the title of the car is exchanged at the exact moment that the payment is exchanged and these types of things. All this stuff just happens automatically. And it seems like there would be a lot of efficiency gains you could get out of a system such as this, especially in a country like Brazil, which does have a fair amount of bureaucracy. Anyway, so it's the main problem that they're encountering right now is this privacy issue, right?
Okay.
They're basically required to comply with Brazil's data protection law, right? There's this a GDPR type of law, like equivalent here.
Yeah.
So obviously, if you have this like permissioned network where like these banks and these actors are basically broadcasting out different transactions to the network and things like that, there needs to be measures taken to ensure that the consumer data and the entity data that's involved in these transactions is not just available for anybody to just look at and be like, oh, great, Johnny spent 10 reais on coffee this morning or whatever. Like these types of things need to be protected. But they also need to do that at scale, right? Because we're talking about the financial system of an entire G20 country
Yeah.
that's going to be running on this thing, ideally. So they've been trying out these different privacy solutions using various kind of like zero knowledge technology that would mask certain data points in the transaction. And they haven't quite figured out a way to do this at scale, essentially. So that's the main pain point that they're facing. I think right now we're also seeing the emergence of a Drex resistance movement, if I can call it that,
Okay.
where you have some members of Congress that have become very vocal about Drex is going to limit the financial freedom of Brazilians. This is another way that the government's going to surveil you.
Is this anti-crypto or is it more populist in sense?
I mean, a lot of these guys are actually very pro crypto. Like one of the guys that is involved in this Drex resistance movement, he actually introduced legislation to create a strategic Bitcoin reserve in Brazil.
Okay.
A lot of these guys, they seem to understand the technology well enough to where they're like, okay, we want Bitcoin. We don't want these kind of state run blockchains. And I think after the whole like PIX debacle from earlier this year, the PIX taxation, like the 5,000 reais limit per account that the Lula government had to like walk back,
Yeah.
it was a bit of a vergonia, if I can say that. I think people are a little more skeptical toward these types of projects just generally. I don't necessarily think that their concerns are 100% legitimate. I mean, there's two different types of CBDCs, right? There's retail CBDCs, which would be like, okay, as a consumer, I have
Yeah.
just my bank account just directly with the central bank, and the central bank issues me my tokens. And this is like the Chinese model, right? Where if you comply with our social credit scores, like you say something bad about the government, then we're just going to burn like 50% of your money and then whatever. That's more like kind of the social control type of mechanism, right? Where the wholesale CBDC is really more of banks sort of settling transactions with each other, like on the back end, like they already do. This is just trying to provide more efficiency in that regard. The average person is not necessarily going to be trading Drex with people or holding Drex or anything like that.
The way I'd always had it explained to me was obviously very simplified, just a digital escrow system for large purchases. So that car payment use case being the one of I'm not going to give you cash till you give me the title to the car, but I'll put it here. I'll pay you in Drex, but it doesn't get released until the title transfers, right? Just kind of managing that area of fraud and, also suspicious of the motivation of some of the anti-Drex people maybe they don't want the people knowing that they're spending Drex or spending money that they maybe shouldn't have, right? So
Yeah.
Brazil is a country where there is shady things that happen, for lack of a better statement, and things that you want to avoid. And so, but Pix for some of the challenges that it's faced has been super successful. And Drex was this next step in the former central bank's view of the monetary system and of the financial system. And so just curious how you explained it, giving some background. I think what you shared has been great. And there's still questions about it, I think, is the main takeaway. I don't know if there's anything you want to add there, but I also would love to hear a little bit more about some of the crypto regulation that you mentioned as well, just to wrap up this part of the conversation.
Yeah, I think maybe to conclude on the Drex front, the origination of the Drex idea came from a paper that was written by this Swiss kind of blockchain lawyer, academic guy. I think his name is Fabian Schar. And he wrote this paper a couple of years ago and it was just basically laying out this idea of like a smart contract based financial system, right? That was kind of the origin of the Drex idea. And when I look at what they're trying to propose, I'm like, this is going to happen eventually. Like at some point in time, our financial systems are going to like run on these types of protocols, essentially. But I think the central bank took like the best stab they could at getting this kind of over the finish line while Huberto Campos Neto was still president. He was the one kind of really driving a lot of this.
Yeah.
It doesn't seem like the new president is as keen to it. We'll just say that diplomatically. I mean, he hasn't come out like trashing the project or anything, but we know there's been a lot of tensions between Lula and Campos Neto, and Galípolo is more aligned with Lula than he is Campos Neto. And we know that there's other priorities now. And obviously, like, there's kind of like a technocrat division within the central bank that's just going to keep doing their thing regardless. But in a bureaucratic organization, it helps when you have a top down mandate coming from the very top that, hey, we're doing this thing
Yeah.
versus the guys in the innovation lab or whatever. I don't know. I think it's a super interesting project. It's probably the most interesting CBDC project in the world right now. And it's the only real CBDC project I've seen. I'm not really an expert on this, but only one I've seen anywhere in the world that kind of has the right match of harnessing all the benefits of a type of system like this
Yeah.
without just completely nuking the existing traditional banking system. So if you just introduce a retail CBDC where you and I just have our accounts directly with the central bank, well, why do you need a banking system at that point? What's the point of having Itaú and BTG and all these guys? And on the regulation front, we still don't know exactly what this is going to look like. We've been going through a couple of rounds of consultations that the central bank has been putting out, basically seeking feedback from the industry. And they've done a pretty good job with this to their credit. The first consultation they put out wasn't even like a draft regulation. It was just a list of questions where they're like, hey, like you guys are the experts. You tell us how should we approach these questions of things like asset segregation, cybersecurity, a whole list of questions. They've taken their time with coalescing and aggregating all this stuff and coming up with their own framework. But they released a second consultation late last year. And then the idea is that by June, July ish, there'll be a final regulation that comes out that will establish basically a licensing regime for VASPs, is what they're called, virtual asset service providers. Very uninspiring acronym. But basically, like you're licensed to be like a crypto brokerage in Brazil, right? And then the licensing process will open up for that. And companies will be able to begin applying for these licenses. And then from there on out, it'll probably be at least 2 years more before any company officially receives the license. So we don't know exactly what's going to be in that final regulation. We know what the central bank has proposed, and what it appears they're leaning toward is a set of
Right.
rules that's like pretty in line with like international standards, we'll say. The big fight has been around this issue of like asset segregation and segregation of order books, essentially, because it's easier for the central bank to regulate you if your order book is all just Brazilian market liquidity, basically. But if you're an exchange like a Binance or one of these kind of global exchanges like a Coinbase or somebody, like this is a global market, right? You have global liquidity. You can offer much better spreads and prices on things and just options of different trading pairs and things of that nature. So there's been a bit of a tension around that, around just how to regulate the domestic Brazilian based exchanges like your Mercado Bitcoin versus your come offshore, but they're just exchanges that aren't headquartered in Brazil, basically, whether it be a Coinbase or a Binance or somebody. And these guys have much different operating structures, and they have a much different kind of product set, much different order books and that type of thing. So that's been where a lot of the tension has been. There's a lot of kind of real hand-to-hand combat on this stuff back, a couple of years ago when they were getting enabling legislation passed around crypto regulation back in late 22. Basically, there's just a lot of tension between like the global exchanges come in and they basically have kind of a better product, they have better prices, better liquidity. The local exchanges have more intimate knowledge of the local market, but maybe like their product offering isn't quite as good and they have more regulations they have to comply with. So they're going to the regulator and saying like, hey, like these bad guys from overseas are coming and they're not complying and they're doing all this bad stuff. But at the same time, like Binance has 60-70% of the trading volume and market share in the country. So it's like, well, people are clearly like, voting with their feet. So it's a tension. It's a natural tension that I think you see in every industry. It's not just crypto, but it's posed a lot of interesting questions. This is a global asset class. This isn't just something that exists in Brazil. So how do you protect Brazilian consumers? How do you respect Brazilian laws and kind of the financial system while still acknowledging that, hey, this is a global industry, right? This is a global product, essentially.
And Brazilian businesses. Yeah, that all makes sense. What have you learned about crypto since coming to Brazil? You said you started 2015, right? 2017 was doing some research on the system, started getting more into it, paying attention. What have been some of the things that maybe you thought about crypto that you've had your mind changed on or that you've learned since you moved to Brazil and how people use it, how people think about it?
Yeah, it's a great question. I guess I would say really the importance of Latin America, the Latin American region, I think, in the narrative of crypto's development, just generally worldwide, right? Like I've always been familiar with the problems of Latin America. Like when you think about it intuitively, just the use case for crypto is pretty obvious here, but it's not necessarily like that much different than perhaps other emerging market economies or regions like in Africa or Southeast Asia or maybe even Eastern Europe or something like that. But I think what you have here, which is super interesting, is kind of like I was mentioning earlier, you have just all these different prototypes of different types of markets that are adopting crypto in their own respective way, like from your Argentina to your Brazil to your Venezuela.
Yeah.
And I forgot to mention El Salvador, which is the ultimate edge
Yes.
case where they've just gone full on Bitcoin mode. So I think kind of comes to the conclusion, like if we can't get crypto like to work in Latin America, then what are we even doing as an industry? Like what's the point of all this, right? Because it's just like such an obvious natural fit. And I think it's been kind of shocking to me to see like how when you talk to like just regular people in the industry, like they kind of get it, but it's just not really a priority at the moment, like this part of the world. It's like, okay, fine. But if you can get your product to work in Latin America, then that's the game right there. And I think Latin America, for all of its faults, is still a middle income region, right? This is a wealthier region than places like sub Saharan Africa or a lot of markets in Southeast Asia. You have potential volume here to be like significant enough for crypto operators to come consider launching here. And you are seeing a lot more of that interest coming in. But I thought it'd be easier to convince the rest of the crypto world that, like, hey, you should come pay attention to Latin America. There's a lot of stuff going on here that would be a good fit for your product because you don't have the trading volume here and you don't necessarily have like this base of developer talent that you might have in other countries as well. But you have the users.
Yeah.
That's the thing. I mean, crypto's getting to this point now where like stable coins is a really hot narrative in 25. I think it kicked off back in late 2024 when there was this company called Bridge, like this kind of API company that nobody had ever heard of that got acquired for $1 billion by Stripe. So now everyone in crypto is trying to pivot to be a stablecoin company so they can get acquired by Stripe also, right? And then
Doesn't work that way. There's only so many stripes that can acquire you, right? You missed the boat already.
exactly. But if you want to be a stablecoin company, like you got to have users, right? So where are you going to find those users? Like, well, in this part of the world, that's a product that people want. 90% of the crypto volume in Brazil right now is denominated in USDT. That's obviously a product that has, product market fit, whether it be as a dollar hedging against the currency as an investment, right? Or whether it be cross-border payments for either individuals or businesses. When you look at it, if you're trying to build real products for real people, like this is where the users are.
Okay, interesting. That's a great learning. And hopefully some people will listen to this and take more focus on Brazil. That's the point, I think, of both of our efforts here in producing content. But I want to change gears. I want to hear a little bit about your experience living in Brazil and specifically the fact that you don't live in, Rio or Sao Paulo. You don't live kind of in these major gringo centers. So, what has your experience been like living in Brazil? And how do you think about living in Brazil as a gringo, especially not in these huge metropolitan areas?
Yeah, it's been a really like mixed experience. I mean, I love living here. It's great. I came back from the US recently for Christmas, and it was the first time since I'd kind of formally moved here that I felt a little homesick, right? The first 2 years, I was like, don't care. This is way better. I like it here.
As long as I get my wings when I go home, I'm good. I can buy myself another few months before I need to go back and eat a piece of pizza.
Yeah, get a Buffalo Wild Wings or something. Yeah, exactly. But it's one thing to just kind of visit and you go see the touristy stuff or whatever.
Yeah.
But seeing really like the true Brazil, I think, is just super fascinating. I always wanted to be an explorer when I was growing up. Like I used to love reading about Christopher Columbus and all these guys. And I was kind of sad that like the whole world's kind of explored now. There's nothing left to find. So like, what am I going to do with my life? But I feel like coming to Brazil, like as a gringo, when you walk into a town in the center of Brazil and you're like, I might be the first gringo who's ever stepped foot in this place. You know?
Well, first one in a while at the very least, right?
Yeah, exactly. And then you start speaking Portuguese. My Portuguese is like reasonably good. I can communicate in most situations, but you start talking to people and they're like flabbergasted that there's an American person there talking in Portuguese or whatever. So I really enjoy going to these off the beaten path type places. We did a trip to Belém a couple of years ago, which was just like fascinating, going to all these little islands in the Amazon, all this kind of stuff. Went to like Lençóis Maranhenses last year, which is just the most incredible place in the world. I mean, it was just indescribable, right? Like I'm taking pictures and like, videos and sending them to my coworkers and they're just like, where in the world are you? This is crazy. So I really like that kind of adventure, I guess. I just like this idea of going to these places where you just couldn't go if you didn't know enough about the culture to be able to like actually figure out what's going on in these places, right? So I've enjoyed that part of it. I've enjoyed just getting to know my wife's family and I've met a lot of like my wife's childhood friends and stuff and just learning more about where she grew up in. Like
Yeah.
have my son in a local school here. I mean, that's a whole experience in itself.
Learning Portuguese. Yeah.
Like this school has never had like a gringo kid before, right? So they were like, "Are you sure this is the right school for him?" I'm like, "Nah, I'll be fine." And then like after 2 years, it's, "Oh yeah, he's doing great." Giving him the opportunity to learn a second language fluently. And now they're getting to the age where like the English classes are getting a little harder. So I'm the class English tutor. I'm over to Chew Aaron's house and they're like, "We'll talk in English and we'll help you." Because it is surprising to me, like how little English penetration there is here. That's just something that comes as a shock. I mean, if you go to Europe, most people at least understand something. But like here, especially when you get outside the main cities, there's very little English proficiency, which is quite shocking. But it's been good because it kind of just forces you to stretch yourself in that regard. I think the fitness culture here has been really positive. It's so easy to live like an active, healthy lifestyle here compared to where I was anyway.
A lot of fried food still.
Yeah, a lot of fried food still, a lot of starchy food, but I think within 15 minutes of my house, there's 6 gyms. Going to the gym is a Brazilian pastime. It's up there with the beach and, Havaianas and whatever. So it's been really pretty positive externalities, you could say, just on my life in general, eating better and being out in sun more and all that kind of stuff, exercising more. So I've really enjoyed that. It has been a little harder to like make friends here who aren't gringos, I guess we'll put it that way. Like I have kind of a base of friends who are like my wife's friends, but it's been kind of difficult to like just create like meaningful relationships.
It's also just being an adult, my friend. Harder to make friends when you're not stuck in a dorm room with them,
Yeah, exactly. And my language skills are like good enough, but they're not great. So the things I can talk about are like kind of limited. So anyway, so that's been maybe a little harder than I was expecting, even though like generally Brazilians are like easier to make friends with than Americans, I would say on the aggregate. Like I work remote too, so I'm not like in an office. So I have to force myself to like go to other places to like socialize or whatever. But anyway, that's kind of like the quick and dirty of my experience here thus far.
Very cool. Well, lots of things we could spend another hour talking about, but I do want to be cognizant of your time. And I always like to end my podcasts asking people what the expression Brazil is not for beginners means. And you're kind of ending your beginner period here in Brazil. So I'm curious what the expression means to you.
Yeah, it is a great question. Probably like the best way of summarizing life in this country. I had explained to me once the difference between the American Anglo-Saxon culture versus kind of the Latin culture. It was just like the skeleton key that made everything make sense to me. Where in Americans and Anglo-Saxon type cultures like Germanic or whatever, efficiency is a key value, right? It's just how do you be most productive? How do you get most done in the shortest amount of time? And in Latino cultures, in Brazil especially, it's all about the process, right? So it's like we ran out of eggs. My brain's okay, what's the quickest, easiest place I can go to get eggs? But like the Brazilian mind thinks, oh, maybe I should call Chia Marisa. She knows a good guy that sells eggs. And maybe like the neighbor down there knows a good egg place too. And it's just so many like complications, I'm like, I don't need all that. I just want eggs. I don't need like 50 people's opinions.
I don't need an egg person.
Yeah, I just need an egg. That's all I need. It doesn't need to be complicated. So, like, once I figured that out and I could use that as a heuristic for understanding some of these situations you encounter, you're just like, this just makes no sense. Why do they do it this way? And then you're like, oh, okay, well, it's the process. It's just how they do things here. I don't know if that's necessarily unique to Brazil either. I think that you could probably apply that to different Latino countries, but I found it to be especially true here. It's definitely the culture that you have to accept things the way they are without trying to like over rationalize stuff.
Yeah, this is Brazil.
Can I ask you, what does it mean to you? What was the inspiration?
I love the quote. I like Tom Jobim's music. And it seemed like an obvious name for a podcast about doing work in Brazil. But, I was founding a startup at the time. I've, lived here off and on for a long time. And I think that Brazil just has complexity and bureaucracy that until you're here and you deal with it, it doesn't make any sense to you. Things happen a certain way because they've always happened a certain way. And people are happy with that. It ties into the whole jeitinho thing. I think the system's broken, but for the people that have figured out how to make it work for themselves, it works for them. And so they almost don't want to fix it because then their advantage disappears. And so that's, I think, why Brazil is not for beginners is until you have your jeitinho, until you figure out your way through the impediments and the impediments that are on top of the initial impediments, it's really hard. But there's fast ways, there's shortcuts that people find, and then that's how you begin to adapt to it. It's not a place where everything is necessarily black and white. I think everything is very much shades of gray in Brazil. And that makes it fun and exciting, but also makes it challenging at times. So lots of great responses to my questions on this podcast around frictions being opportunities. And I think that's what Brazil is not for beginners means to me. But I just love the phrase. It's a good one.
Yeah.
And then you kind of answered it a little bit with your response to what does Brazil is not for beginners mean to you. But are there any Brazilian expressions or habits or things that you've seen that really stand out as being a foreigner? One of them is vamos marcar, right? That's come up a few times. Like, hey, let's schedule it, but doesn't actually mean let's schedule it. Like they're just kind of nice about it. I'm wondering if there's any that stand out for you in your time here.
I think maybe one funny example and one serious example, because I lived with my wife for like 10 years in the US before I came to Brazil and really started understanding Brazilian culture more. I noticed with her, there's all these like weird things that she would get very upset about, right? If I slammed the car door, she'd like freak out about it. Like slamming a car door is a cardinal sin. If we're trying to ask directions on the street, she would always ask multiple times, multiple people. And I'm like, why do you have to ask this person? We just talked to this other person and they told us, go over here, get eggs or whatever. Why are you talking to this other person? And she's like, oh, I just want to make sure. And then in the US, if someone on the street comes and asks me, hey, do you know where this thing is? I don't know where it is. I'll be like, sorry, I don't know where that is. But like here, people, sometimes they'll just tell you something anyways, even if they don't know. They'll be like, oh, it's over there somewhere. It's like they're like trying to be helpful, but like
they don't want to say no.
Yeah, it's like rude to say no or something. So they just give you like some random answer. I mean, we actually had this experience at a shopping mall last weekend. We're like looking for this store and the security guards, oh, it's like over there. And then you walk over there and it's not there. And you ask people like, oh, it's actually closed or it's like on the other side of the building or whatever. And it's like, why couldn't the first guy have just told me that to begin with?
Yeah, tell me to ask somebody else.
So now I understand like why my wife is always asking multiple confirmations before just take somebody's word for it. You always have to ask multiple times, multiple people. So anyways,
those are also both new ones. I tend to get people repeating some of the ones before, but those are both great ones. Don't slam the car door and ask multiple people for directions. I love it. Aaron, this was a lot of fun. I really appreciate you giving so much of your time and chatting with us about your experience here in Brazil, as well as your views of the crypto industry and how it's evolving. How can people follow you and reach you and engage with you?
Yeah, so I'm on Twitter, just like Brazil Crypto Report, and then YouTube, also Brazil Crypto Report.
Awesome.
You can find links to my newsletter there as well. I'm also pretty heavy on LinkedIn, just Aaron Stanley. There's not too many Aaron Stanleys in Brazil, so I'm sure you'll find me. Shoot me a note. I love chatting with folks who have interest in this country, whether you're here already or interested in the market for whatever reason. Happy to always chat with anybody.
Yeah, that's how we connected.
Yeah. There's not too many gringo podcasters in Brazil. It's a small universe,
Yes, we got to support each other.
Exactly.
Well, I appreciate you coming on and talking to us. This was great.
Yeah, likewise. Appreciate the invitation.
Awesome. Thanks everyone so much for listening. Hope you enjoyed.
Ciao.
Thanks again for joining us. This podcast was hosted by me, Isaac Matzner. It was produced and edited by Maria Filmes. You can find more episodes on Spotify, Apple Podcast, and YouTube, as well as on our Substack page. We do love feedback, so please feel free to reach out to us on social media or via email at Brazil4beginners@gmail.com.